Welcome to the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Miley, an IFS-informed certified trauma recovery coach. This show features interviews from survivors all over the world as they share their impactful story of thriving in their post-traumatic growth. We explore resources, tools, and coping skills to support the trauma survivor community. Enjoy. Welcome back to the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Miley. I am an IFS-informed trauma recovery and lifestyle design coach. I have with us today Becky Garrison. Becky, thanks so much for joining us. Becky is a survivor of her family's alcoholism and narcissistic abuse. She has her master's now of divinity from Yale and social work degree from Columbia. She is uniquely qualified to speak on the topic of spiritual abuses in church-related settings. Her works addressing this topic can be found in Spirituality and Health, Women in Theology, and the Wittenberg Door Gaslighting for God, as well as an interview by the Desert Sanctuary. Her latest books, Roger Williams' Little Book of Virtues and Distilled in Washington in History. These books are aimed to bring hope that point the community forming outside of the confines of institutional church and the Christian celebrity culture. Becky, thanks so much for joining us. This is one of those hot topics. So I know we can go a million different places with this today. So I'm just thankful to have you here. Please tell the people a little bit more about your story and what your childhood was like for you.
Well, when people ask me, why did I become a religious satirist? The simple answer is my late father, the Reverend Carl Garrison Jr., and his hippie Earth Mother wife were idealists, beautiful idealists, wanting to change the world for the good. He was a sociology professor and an Episcopal priest. He was researching what was drawing young people. Why were some young people getting pulled to the Jesus movement? Why were others going to SDS? He was amazing. Our house was filled with college students. It was absolutely beautiful and blissful. Little hippie kid me did not realize that my parents were alcoholics and that a lot of what I was seeing around me were people not in very, to put it mildly, inappropriate situations. I don't recall everything that I saw, but I just remembered, and our family marked our family as the black sheep. We were the idealistic hippie losers. Wow. So they pretty much discarded us, which enabled them to forget the fact that they themselves had their own drinking issue, their own dismissing issue. It's much easier to displace onto my parents than to deal with their own issues. Yeah. So when my parents, after they passed away, I did a lot of healing work with them. The recovery movement was just starting in the 80s, which was very exciting. And that's why it took years to understand why the professions did not understand my parents' alcoholism. This was the 70s. People would have to realize that before Betty Ford came forward, there were no resources on alcoholism. So I delved into the recovery, codependency literature, ate it up like crazy, did a lot of recovery movement, but then there was still something feeling a little bit amiss. I could avoid being in alcoholic situations, but yet I was still attracted to these type of people like my father, a very charismatic, dynamic person. And it wasn't until I wrote a book in 2010 called Jesus Died for This, that I looked at Meryl Marco, and she described the David Letterman situation. And she was describing what a narcissist was, someone who could not see beyond themselves. Then it hit me. My dad was a narcissist too. I didn't pick up on it because a lot of the traits of alcoholism are very similar to narcissism. The self-centeredness, the inability to express empathy and compassion. And as my father never sobered up, I didn't know, I just attribute all that to alcoholism. But then having heard from people who sobered up, but they were still just, the behaviors did not stop. Right. I realized those were people who were alcoholics who were also narcissists. Mm-hmm. And that began to do my unpacking. And when I moved to the Pacific Northwest, I wanted here to explore, the rise of secular spirituality here. I was pretty much done with the institutional church. I had discovered that it just wasn't a very viable institution. The numbers were dropping, but yet everybody was out seeking something. So I wanted to come out here to see what are people seeking. Mm-hmm. In that, I connected with a mindfulness therapist, some ecstatic dance groups, a tantra teacher, and other people. And I soon realized that this mindfulness therapist and the tantra teacher and some others, they possess extreme narcissistic qualities. Mm-hmm. So why am I still attracted to these? I then began to seek out a narcissist support group. And through that, I began to unpack narcissism and realizing you broke what I would call the trauma bond of being attracted to that energy. I now look at that energy and I still feel a twinge. Oh, that would be kind of cool to be part of the cool kid crowd. But then I go, no, That's not good for my diet. It's kind of like breaking a bad habit to sugar or any other addiction. I now no longer feel attracted to that energy.
Wow, that is so tough. What were when you were in your childhood, and you weren't even necessarily recognizing all of these things, what were some of the most difficult parts of growing up in that environment?
I think the biggest difficulty, this is what led me to be a religious satirist, I was the family white elephant spotter. I was always the kind of kid, I don't know why, I was born with a built-in massive ass BS detector. I just could tell. And I'd be like, why is grandma passed out? Grandma's not passed out. She's taking a rest. So my reality was denied from the get-go. I would do things. I would get into shrieking matches with my mother in the hopes that somebody would recognize that something is wrong and come in and intervene. And in fairness to outsiders, the research on alcoholism wasn't there. I've had to forgive a number of people for just not knowing. They just said they did not understand the family, how this impacts an entire family. They just thought all dad needed to do was sober up.
Right.
And the fact that he can't meant that he was a weak individual. They did not understand the dynamics of alcoholism. And also, as we know, the research into narcissism has only been about 10 years old. So that was the biggest thing, is that I was the family scapegoat. And that continued. My parents succumbed, their idealism succumbed to their addictions. They died when I was a teenager. And being orphaned in a narcissistic family is not something I would wish on people. Wow. Fortunately, I had a grandmother who I now see in hindsight, her overindulgence led to my father becoming a narcissist. I can understand that, how she created that environment. However, she was incredibly loving and kindness, and she took me in. When I was in my early 20s, I had a spiritual director who took me in, and different people throughout the times took me in and cared for me. And had they not done that, I don't know where I would be. My guess is pushing daisies. Wow. So I think I'm very grateful for the people in my life who have just come through and they saw a goodness that others didn't see. And they recognized that I was struggling and I was acting out. Anyone who is in a trauma situation acts out. I didn't act out in school. I was the perfect kid. In many ways, I was the oldest child, the perfect kid. And I was also the ideal scapegoat. In my family system, my brother was the golden boy. And my sister was the beauty. I was the creative loser, dreamer, artist type. So in that sense, it took a lot for me to sort of realize I don't fit into my family. I don't fit into the contemporary world. I am a creative person and I followed my own path. It took quite a lot to get to that point. But in the meantime, you feel like you're totally useless. You don't belong in this family. And it took a lot for me to finally say, actually, it wasn't until my sister passed away last year and the family from, drinking and smoking, that was the ultimate cause, even though the death certificate says something else. And nobody from my family bothered to tell me. I discovered it when a kind cousin told me, oh, you might want to call your brother. I called him, he didn't answer. I Googled, and that's how I discovered she passed. Wow. And at that moment, it was a very empowering thing. I decided I emailed every member of my family that I'm still in touch with, which wasn't very many, and said, how did you hear of this news? And those who did not respond, I blocked out of my life. I have about half a dozen people still in my life. And it was the healthiest decision I ever made in my life. And I'm very happy. You finally, sometimes you just have to walk away. And that's the only thing I think you can do in a narcissistic situation, ultimately, is to get up the strength, get up the resources, and leave. You cannot solve this. This is the hardest. This is a coach. You cannot solve someone who is in an extreme narcissistic situation. The rate of recovery, that's just not worth your energy on this planet.
Yeah. Thank you for naming that. I think it's a great segue to kind of go where we're going to end up eventually going today, which is the spiritual trauma, narcissism in the church. Let's just dive in. What is going on out there? What is happening?
Well, what's very interesting is that surveys have been conducted. This research is relatively new. We have to be honest. We're where alcoholism research was in the 80s. There's so much we don't know. And we're already discovering this huge push in the religious trauma field. I just want to make this clear. For a lot of people positioning themselves to become the expert, so this is becoming like a whole market thing. So I'm a little bit, as I talk about this, I want to help people be healing, but also be cautious when you get into this field. There's a lot of charlatans out there wanting to promote themselves as the guru who will heal you. So be very careful when you go through this to actually do the work, do the research, and As I said, I connected and was in Portland with a mindfulness therapist who proved to be a sociopath. And I did the O'Hare psychotherapy test psychopathy test on him. And he scored incredibly high. So just because I'm just going to offer that as a kind of cautionary tale, but for what's happening in the church, the few limited research we've shown has been the average population we think is 1 to 6% extreme narcissistic personality disorder. The 2 surveys I've seen, which are very preliminary, much more work needs to be done, puts clergy at about 25%. And I would put that at the low end of the spectrum.
I would too.
Yeah. And what seems to be happening, and this has been happening since the founding of our country, when certain people claimed we were being founded as a city on the hill. We are American exceptionalism. And yes, we want to be proud of our country. I'm not going to say that. But the view was that my particular form of the Puritan faith is the only faith that is permitted. And if you do not follow that faith, you will be killed. Yeah. That is, and my ancestor, Roger Williams, which I realized I have a spark of him in him, came up and he said, no, everyone should be free to worship as they please. As long as they're forming, of course, within the letter of the law, they're not breaking the law, they're not harming people. And by doing so, he became banished. So we've had this conflict in our country between, do we get to worship as we please, or do we need to follow what is prescribed, what is required? Mm-hmm. And that is, we've also had, I think, and I'm going to trace this back to the 60s with my father, people were searching for something. Yeah. They were searching for that summer of love. They are searching for that connection. And I would say we're now in another searching period, because after the 60s, that led to the 70s. And then the 80s, it became the totally not Me Too generation. Yeah. And then we had the whole Wall Street, collapse. But starting with the financial collapse in 2008, people have just been, I would say a lot of us are just adrift. Where do we go? Where do we find? And in that environment, it is ripe for someone to come in and say, I have the answers. Yeah. I will help you form a new kind of Christianity. I will help you form a new form of faith. I will help you express your sexuality in ways you've never experienced it. I will help connect you to that and whatever line they're going to say. I mean, just look at the plethora of Netflix documentaries, Hulu, HBO. They range from the extreme LDS fundamentalists to the extreme, the vow, which I would say was definitely of a secular spiritual bent. We are in a culture where we are we're looking for answers. And instead of trying to do the hard work of finding that ourselves, it's so much easier. That person gave me what I needed. I felt so good. And to understand that we're just being love bombed to death. And the inverse of love bombing is trauma bonding. You're becoming so addicted to this person. You need that buzz that you no longer can see when things are amiss. Live with a red flag. It's kind of like being obsessively in love. You cannot, you ever try to talk a friend or even yourself out, when you're totally smitten with somebody, you're not going to hear diddly squat.
Yes, that is so true. The love bombing is very important, and the gaslighting and all of these other, big, hashtags and buzzwords that we use now because we're understanding more and more about narcissism. And I mean, at this point, everyone's pointing a finger. Oh, I know this one was a narcissist and this one and this one. And we're kind of, diagnosing people, and it's become a real buzzword. But the thing about it is this has been around always. Narcissists have always been amongst us. We're just now, taking blinders off of our eyes, and we're able to see them more clearly. So it does seem like, oh, it's in the media all the time and everybody's a narcissist and all the buzzwords, and you can hashtag it to death. But the reality is that these are the people that are doing a lot of serious harm to people who already have really low self-worth, but they're definitely hitting the integrity of their self-worth, and they're bringing them to a place where if you don't have self-love, but this person loves you, it is going to be really hard to separate from that person. So what would be some of these warning signs that, especially I'm thinking about the church and other particular, cultic organizations, what are some warning signs that people can be looking for, or do they just stay away from all of this altogether?
Well, I would say when you're entering into any kind of a new group, the one thing I look for, and the first sign is, do I feel, because we do tend to overuse the word narcissist. When you walk into a space, do I feel that people here have the ability to express empathy and compassion? Is what I'm hearing coming from the pulpit something that even has any kind of remote from this? Or all you doing is just criticize? I've been to churches of all political stripes. And I feel like I'm hearing a political rally. I'm not hearing anything that's going to uplift me and try to help me to live a better life.
Yeah.
That would be the first thing, is if you walk into there and you get the sense that there's nothing different here. This is just a kind of a gathering of people, that nobody here really cares. Everybody's like strutting around pretending that everything is great. That's the moment I walk into that place, walk out. But secondly, as you get into this, are they interested in me? Or are they interested in my money? I mean, I did this experiment once where I sent out emails to, I'd say about 20, 25 Episcopal and Lutheran churches once in New York City, just to see, so I was going to change churches and just seeing, and I just said, I'm interested. Almost all, the first thing they sent me was a request to pledge.
Wow.
I had not even stepped into the church, or an invite to a very pricey event. I chose the one church of the one person who said, hey, it sounds great. Let me know if you want to meet me for coffee. That was the church I chose to attend. And that's one sign is, what are they, and also when you go to the table, is there anything there that looks like it's welcoming? Right. These are very simple things. You don't realize it, and if you ever feel like, I don't know if I belong here, I'm not cool enough, I'm not it enough, whatever it is, that's a sign that they're trying to mold a certain culture. This was very prominent at Hillsong, for example. And you feel like, I don't have enough tattoos. I don't have enough. I'm kind of dumpy, or I feel kind of just not there. That's not a sign. You just get the hell out, because that is a church that has a certain brand image, and you're not going to ever be able to fit that brand. You look at the leadership. Do you see people? Like I went to hear Rob Bell give this little talk, and he was at a gay inclusive church. All the ushers were men. And I was like, how is this inclusive if they're all men and white? So if you're telling me, is welcome telling me that all are welcome?
Right.
Do I get the sense that do they have, that's one of the key things. Because a lot of these churches are not truly welcoming.
Yeah.
Secondly, if they keep telling you, we have the answers. Our church is going to give you something different that nobody else gave you. That's not true. Any community is going to be full of just, raggedy kind of people that are just trying to make sense of life. This is going to be this shiny big thing. And they're going to try to tell you all these things. That if you join this, you get this. Looking for this, a charismatic leader, Brad Sargent, a futurist guy, has done excellent research on this. And it points to, they know what you're looking for. They know what is missing here. And they will give this to you. Like you're hearing a lot of conversation. We're going to give you a third way away from this political polarization. We're going to show you a better way of being, a more enlightened way. And then you get into it, and you realize, this isn't quite what it is. And one thing to see is, do they want you if you don't volunteer? Or do they want, and you don't give money? Are you welcome just as you?
Yeah.
Or is there a push? And the thing was, like, I did not realize this until I got out of the system, because I'm an excellent volunteer. I was one of those Uber volunteers that could do everything, excellent organization. If you're a freelancer, you have very valuable skills. But the moment I couldn't volunteer, the phone call stopped. So one way to test something, say no. What happens when you say no? Now, some people might say, I'm disappointed. I'd love to see you. I'll look forward to seeing you again. A narcissist cannot handle a rejection.
Yeah.
So, and I'm not saying you need to test someone unfairly, but a little test is to just try it out. Tell somebody, I'll take a few weeks off and I'll come back in a few weeks. A normal person would be like, yeah, we look forward to seeing you. Yeah. A narcissist is like, you must come back. There's like, what's wrong with you?
They need you, what you're bringing. Yeah.
And the second is, can you, what I call pay to play? Like this happens in a lot of the conference circles. Can you make any connections if you don't have to fork over money? Now this is not the same. Like if you're going to see a teacher, yes, you're going to be paying money for this teacher. So in that case, there's but for a church setting, do you have to pay to play? Because there are churches where, if you pay a certain amount, you get certain privileges, you get certain rankings, you get certain better treatment than other people. To see, and is all truly welcome here? What if, I remember asking a very liberal church once during the Iraq War, and this is what led me to leave this church, is, would Bush be welcome to receive communion here? Now, Bush is a Methodist. He says he's a Christian. If he comes to church and wants to receive communion, would you give it? Would you be okay with that? And the answer was no. I'm like, well, if you wouldn't give someone communion just because you don't agree with their political beliefs, you feel they're a warmonger, what does that say about where you're coming from? That you are forming a tribe. And that's one thing. We all want to kind of be around people that are like us sometimes. And sometimes it's good to find your tribe, find the people. But when you find the tribe, it's people that let you be you. And too often they're saying, we're going to form tribe. It's becoming a form of tribalism, which is different than saying, I want to find my community of like-minded people where I can just be. That's a lovely ideal goal. If people who find that, it's beautiful. But too often you're asked to form into a form of tribalism where there's a prescribed set of beliefs.
Yeah.
And if you deviate from those beliefs, you're banned. I mean, we saw this during COVID, where it was immediately clear where if you were vaccinated, you were the good people. If you were unvaccinated, you were a Trump supporter, and you were therefore a bad person. There was never any discussion or nuance. And there's just one simple example, which is pretty obvious. People lost friendships. People lost their ability to form in communities because they took a certain stance. Like if somebody, now granted, okay, if somebody walks in and they're doing a violent act or they're doing something they shouldn't be doing, yes, they should be removed. But there was no room for dialogue, no room for discussion, no room for people to have a difference of opinion. It was not permitted.
Yeah.
And that's a sign that you're in a very rigid culture, where we all are going to be following this. And the key thing that's missing here is an accountability structure. The number one sign, like I reported, that is this thing to look out for. Where could you go if you had a problem? I mean, and I know it sounds awful, as women, I don't know about you, but I often look, when I go to a club, a bar somewhere, I'm well aware of the signs that I can tell a bartender that I need to leave. I've never had to use them, but every woman knows how to signal a bartender. Yeah. That it's time just to exit the place, because there's no accountability structure here. Just look for this. How are the finances being handled? What is the chain of command? Where would you go if, let's say, one of the clergy members happened to, grab your butt or do something, or just speak to you in a way that was very demeaning? Is there anybody that could hear you out if you experience something? I mean, as simple as just, like, I'm not feeling comfortable in this situation. Right. Where could you go to talk about that problem? Priest chews you out, or something happens that just doesn't make sense to you.
Yeah. Or it's a question, something that's been taught, right? So if the priest or the pastor says something at the pulpit that doesn't sound right to you, where can you go to question that theology? And that, with a narcissistic pastor, they wouldn't even entertain that. Absolutely not. I have a divine connection with God, and that's what he told me to say. And that's what I said. End of story, right? But if someone is open to being teachable and coachable, to go, oh, I think maybe you made a little slip right there, because I don't know that's, can we explore that? Or I'd like to hear more about it. Someone who's coachable would be open to something like that. Yeah.
It's also, will they hear you? Like I recall, there's a major leader in the emergent church world, this person named Brian McLaren. And I remember going to him, a number of people have gone to people multiple times saying, we know so-and-so has been committing on and offline abuses. Now that's all legally I can say. I cannot use terms like sex assault and rape, because until a victim feel comfortable coming forward. What I can say is there's on and offline abuses that I feel comfortable saying. And I'll say that to this person, for example. He said, Becky, why don't you be nice? So that'll happen a lot in progressive circles, especially. You'll say, so-and-so is being a real jackass, or you're just really being horrible. And you go to someone who is in a position to actually do something, meaning they're the bishop, they're a well-known author speaker who endorses work. There's somebody in that circle who, if they said something, it would make a difference. And their response is, be nice. And to this, I want to encourage people to read the book, She Said, and To Catch and Kill, because I want people to understand the difficulty of abuse victims speaking out in situations where they're in positions of power. Yeah. And because I'm tired of people asking me, why is there no evidence? There is no evidence because the priest closed the door. There is no evidence because this is a very charismatic person, and it could be a she, it's usually a he, but with the emergence of females, women are capable of being just as narcissistic as men when put in power. They tend not to be, but argue that's more because they're not in positions of power. There hasn't been a whole lot of, I haven't seen a lot of gender related studies. They do say it's more common in men, but I also question, is it because men are more in power?
Yeah,
you
they're
know?
more in the public eye as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
They're great, great signs because people need to be able to watch out before they get too steeped in, because once you're in it, as you know, it's harder to then see these things. So what about to the people who, are being gaslit, or this is a narcissistic leadership, right? They're have to pledge their devoutness to the leader. Their self-worth is being smaller and smaller every day. What are a couple of small practical steps that they can take to remove themselves if they're starting to see some of
Okay.
these flags?
I've read several articles on the practice of gray rocking, and I think gray rocking is excellent. It's a practice whereby, and I have articles on it in Spirituality and Health, two of them, if you want to read the specifics, but it's basically viewing a person like you view a rock. So you do not give them, an example would be someone says, I haven't seen you for so long. They try to guilt trip you into doing something. You're like, have a nice day.
Yeah.
I'm you just polite. You do not feed the beast.
Yeah.
And it is, and over time you do this and you kind of try to feel good about yourself. The person will walk away and say, it's horrible, horrible. I mean, a good example with this would be, is I remember I had, when I family passed away, this is not a spiritual example, but my aunt, I have an aunt who claims to be an uber Christian. I mean, uber, we're talking one of those like uber Christian types that, she could out Flanders. She, I remember, she sent me an email out of the blue. And she, bear in mind, she contacted me to let me know my sister was dying. She knew this. When she contacted a lot of other relatives, somehow didn't contact me. So she just emailed me and said, I want to let you know your cousin's dying. And I just responded, unsubscribe. That's gray rocking. She emailed back and said, well, I thought you'd be interested in your cousin. Emailed back, I'm very interested in my cousin. I'm not interested in having any contact with family members who did not inform me of my late sister's death. And then I said, if you wish to continue this conversation further, I highly suggest you talk to your pastor and read up on narcissism and trauma. End of email. That's a good example of how you just set a limit with an extreme narcissist who has a strong Christian background. Luckily, this time she didn't use scripture. She didn't try to do that kind of stuff. She's an Episcopalian, so she's not going to do the scripture thing. She's going to do more of the gentle gaslighting kind of, oh, surely you must care about your this. And surely you must care about your family. Yeah, I care about my family. I don't want to have contact with anybody who didn't. So I think that's the first step, is to begin to gray rock. And as you begin to gray rock, you'll discover you can see things a bit more clear. I also recommend finding a narcissistic support group. Read up on narcissism. Once you see the pattern, you can then say, how do I want to respond to the pattern? Because until 2010, I did not realize that my dad was an alcoholic and a narcissist. And they require the way to distance yourself are the same. You cannot be around an alcoholic. You cannot be around a narcissist. They're the same energies. They're not good on an intimate level. You have to drop back to a superficial level. And if you need to maintain contact, let's say because they're related to you, or you to be in that church because your kids go to school. I mean, some people make a sacrifice because their children really love the youth group, or whatever your reason for staying in the church could be valid, but drop back, distance yourself. And don't let people gaslight you into saying, oh, these horrible, gossipy things about you. And then as you continue to do this, is there are there other people there you're sensing the same thing? Could you be forming, a subgroup? There's starting to be with church too an awareness that did not exist when I was in the church world. Right. So people are now starting to talk about this. They're starting to talk about trauma bonding. They're starting to talk about how love bombing is trauma bonding. You begin to recognize these signs and then start to talk with other people. The narcissistic support group was invaluable. All of a sudden I realized, one, I'm not alone in this. And two, other people had experienced stuff that was just, it was far worse than what I was experiencing. And then in that sense, it made me realize that, oh my God, this is much more pervasive than I thought. But also there is healing from it. We were all coming up with strategies for dealing with this. How do you say no and not let that feeling? And a lot of this also has to do with healing your own trauma. For me, EMDR was the key. I don't want to say everybody must do EMDR because different somatic treatments work for different people. But I do think that the somatic healing that we're doing is very similar in some ways, I think, to when Freud completely revolutionized psychotherapy. You think about it, prior to him, people, if you were mentally ill, you were locked in a hospital and caged. He let them took them out so they could function somewhat in society.
Yeah.
Now, granted, we don't want to use Freud's teachings today because we've done significant advances, but I'm thinking the somatic therapies that I'm seeing evolving have the same ability to radically change. I mean, you can see people doing CBT, all of a sudden, boom, in 5 or 6 sessions, they don't feel that anymore.
Right.
You know, now I did a lot of talk therapy, and it was very helpful to get me to this point to where I am.
Yeah.
But it was EMDR, also I cleared. I'm like, no, you know, so I don't feel, when I sent that email to my aunt, I didn't feel anything.
Yeah.
You know, and that's the goal, is to get yourself to the point where you stand up to the person and you don't feel anything, except, I take it back, you would feel good about yourself.
Yeah. Oh,
but you don't feel that knot in your stomach, like this is like, you get like that, you know, you go, oh my God, this is just, you feel like, no, I'm done.
Because the control is gone, you know, that control that they had to, you know, to pull on your heartstrings or pull at an emotion or view where you're weakest, that part of it is gone. I just want to double down as we wrap up here. I want to double down on the idea of community. And you know, a lot of listeners know a lot about my story, but as I've become more and more public with the spiritual abuse and narcissistic abuse from the church that I left several years ago. It came out last September when I found out that the pastor had aligned himself currently with a sex abuser. And when that came out of woodwork came all of these beautiful people from that church that had left, because we had all slowly figured it out. All the elders stepped away, the staff all left, and the pastor's now kind of left on his own with a very, very body. He's still functioning, but when that community came back out and we realized that we all have the same story, the healing that comes from that, oh my God, that happened to you too. Oh, they said that to you too. Oh my, the aspect is really, really, so I just wanted to share that personal aspect of knowing how important that is for the community to be there. So I want to thank you for sharing your story. I ask all of our guests, and it sounds like for you, EMDR, and obviously just figuring out so much about your narcissistic background with your parents, but what were some of the resources that were really helpful for you in your trauma healing?
Well, I think that just the one book was Rethinking Narcissism, which was a very helpful book because he was explaining healthy narcissism. Because as a creative, you're often called, you're self-centered, you're this, because you want to create something. And there's a difference. It's understanding that the difference between being an echo, where basically the extreme narcissist can totally take advantage of you, to becoming an extreme narcissist, it's on a spectrum. And that the healthy spectrum is to be in the middle, where you care enough about yourself to want to do creative things, to do things on yourself without feeling the need to be an enabler. And it's also, I thought, one brief thing to think about when you're going to this thing. Remember, abuse takes 3 people: the abuser, the enablers, and the watchers. And to think of what cycle you're into that. And the watchers are the ones that I think you can try to reach, who stood by silently and said nothing. To me, in many ways, they also contribute. But you're right, that once you begin to speak out, this is incredible. The resource I found, recently there's been a big breakdown in what I call the emergent church, which was this huge progressive, not huge, but they thought they were huge, progressive movement. It was like, we're going to change the church and everything. And the leaders keep trying to reinvent themselves, keep trying to push themselves. And then recently, Carl Forehand of the Desert Sanctuary, whose podcast I was on, has been doing really good work, along with David Hayward of Naked Pastor, Brad Sargent of The Futurist Guy. There's a lot of people, another woman named Megan Barringer. These people are starting to emerge slowly, like grassrootsy, forming, like, here's a collective of ways we can talk about this, forming informal communities to talk about it. Now, it's very important when you enter these communities to be mindful that they don't become like a cult. It remains a conversation that welcomes all. The leaders are continuing to be embracing, as this evolves, what we know about narcissism now, it's going to change from what we know 10 years from now. Yes. And they're willing to accept that this is going to evolve. We may discover that EMDR is not the way to go. This is a better thing. They're willing to grow. They're willing to learn. And you can find these communities once you step outside of the institutional structures.
Yes. Yeah.
I would say that the institution is too necrotic to be survivable. I would say look for communities where you are welcome and that you can find them. I'm starting to find them now. It's a little bit challenging because right now we're in a very polarized period. So finding people that, and the moment they say, who do you support politically, determines if they feel safe around you, which is a very sad and scary situation we're in right now. So But I think there are people out there that are looking for a third way. They're looking for something different. And it's for those people and connecting with those people and accepting the fact that it's not, and resisting the temptation to buy the next big shiny thing.
Yeah. 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 That sounds like an excellent place for us to wrap up. Becky, thank you for sharing your story. Please tell people where they can find you, more about your works, how to get in touch with you, how to follow you.
Well, I'm at my Facebook author page is Becky Garrison Writer, and that would be pretty much the place where I post a lot of my writing. I'm Instagram at Becky_Garrison. My website is BeckyGarrison.com, where they could also learn a little bit about my writing. The Facebook author page is where I'm probably the most visible.
Love it. Thank you so much. I'm going to have that and all of your resources linked up in the show notes below. Thank you for sharing your time and your heart, and clearly you're passionate about this. So I really appreciate you taking the time today. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bye-bye.